Hello everyone. I welcome you all on behalf of Grant Thornton team to our CPA program demo session. My name is Abhishek Oberoi, and as we proceed forward, we are going to focus today on the auditing and attestation as a subject. In terms of the agenda today, we are going to start first about understanding the exam, what the exam is all about, content allocations, specifically keeping in mind auditing and attestation, and finally, we'll take a sample CPA exam topic with regards to auditing and attestation. In my experience, every time there is a student who comes to me and talks to me about what is CPA exam all about. So the basic answer is CPA examination is basically a consortium or a collection of 4 different subjects, which actually tells you how strong you are with regards to various concepts on auditing and attestation, financial accounting and reporting, business environment and concept, and last but not the least is regulation. As you can see on the screen, all the 4 papers are 4 hours each. Students generally ask me this question: how difficult it is to crack the CPA examination? And my answer to every one of my students is the same. If you have clarity of concept, if you have the dedication and motivation to crack the exam, I'm sure you will be able to crack this exam without doubts. And the basic reason for me to say that is that you have multiple choice questions in this exam. When you have multiple choice questions, the examiner can ask you any concept which is available on that topic, because it's just about one-liner where you have to choose the right options. When you'll be given 4 options, you have to choose the best option. Of the 4 exams, for me personally speaking, the most difficult was auditing and attestation. And even though it was most difficult, it was very exciting as well. Because the generally questions which come in auditing attestation, the questions are not mathematical in nature or numerical in nature. The questions are what is right, what needs to be done to keep everything within the professional boundaries of ethics and integrity. And generally all these questions will be so confusing unless you are to the point, crystal clear as to what your answer should be. Most of the questions carry what is the best possible answer in a given situation. All the answers will look right to you. However, there will be one answer which will be the most appropriate in that given situation. Identifying that answer gets to the point where auditing exam gets a little tricky, but if you spend time, like I said, with dedication and motivation on the subject, I'm sure you'll be able to clear the examination. Let's move forward and talk about auditing and attestation's bifurcation in the examination. As you can see on the screen, the exam contains 72 multiple choice questions and 8 task-based simulations. What are task-based simulations? People generally ask me. These simulations are nothing but a huge case study or a big case study given to you at the beginning of the testlet or the exam paper. And once you go through all those, the entire case study, you have to answer various questions. These are not multiple choice questions, but you have to give the right answers depending on what is your assessment of those case studies. That's where it is also very important to spend time in front of the screen, because generally what we have a habit of is watching movies, but that's not the case when you're studying, reading through on the screen and spending your time in front of it. So we as students do need to get into a habit of reading through the computer as well and not just watching stuff on the screen. And I'm sure with practice, you get into a habit of going through the 4-hour duration of the exam, of reading, understanding everything through the computer screen and giving your paper accordingly. With regards to content areas, as you can see, the primary objective of audit attestation is that you'll be certifying on something, be it financial statement, be it bank statements, so that people can use it to tell to their stakeholders, shareholders, that yes, this is vouched and verified by a third party, somebody who is an expert in that particular area. And that's where, being into the audit field or attestation field, it's important that you fall within the professional ethics, professional responsibilities, and general principles which are guided by US GAS, United States Generally Accepted Account Auditing Standards. Once you know the purview around which the entire framework for auditing has been developed, the next steps is how to perform audit procedures. And that's where you start first with with assessing risk and developing a planned response to that risk. You also need to perform further procedures like additional tests, sample checking, validating balances, physical verifications, and obtaining audit evidences. And finally, all you need to do is form a conclusion. And that's where judgment comes into picture. How good, how well you have actually understood the events of the business for your client. So it's important that you are being tested during the examination on all these 4 points. Historically, allocation of these particular areas, of these content areas, have been given to you as a depiction of which area carries what weightage. And as you can see, performing further procedures and obtaining evidences carry close to 30-40% of the weightage. Apart from that, a lot of skills are also being tested during the examination. The examiner is not just testing you on your theoretical knowledge. The examiner is actually testing you on how do you remember stuff, how do you understand stuff, how do you apply your learnings into practical scenarios, how do you analyze data, and finally, because you have to provide for a sort of opinion after every assessment of a client's financials, you will have to evaluate the position as well. So it's important that all these skills are being tested and the examiner knows about it. You can see on your screen, these are the skills which get weighted about, and 30-40% or close to 60-80% is being tested in terms of how do you remember your ethics well, how do you understand the principles well, and how do you apply all those learnings in practical scenarios. And that's where case studies are given to you. A lot of case studies, be it in multiple choice questions, be it in task-based simulations. We don't have to worry about all that, because if we can read everything through well, we'll be in a better position to crack the exam. I'll give you the basic mantra which I carried during my examination when I was giving the CPA exam, and what I learned while giving my examination, because nobody told me about this, is it's a very time-based examination. You are allotted 4 hours, and in 4 hours you have to crack 72 multiple choice questions and 8 task-based simulations. Let me do and keep equal weightage, because that's what is been given to both the examinations, 50-50% of multiple choice questions and 50% for task-based simulations. Let's say, for example, 2 hours for task-based simulations, in which you will have to do like 4 task-based simulations in 1 hour, 15 minutes each, including your internal reviews, and 72 multiple choice questions in 2 hours. 72 multiple choice questions in 120 minutes. That means every question you get less than 2 minutes. It's so very important that if you want to crack this exam, you should have great time management skills. As we progress further during our course, we will make sure we tell you how to practice to come to the terms where you can crack this paper within time frame as well. Otherwise, you'll be missing out on a lot of stuff, because once you get into the loop of going and reviewing each and every question, you may never know where you spend more than 5 minutes on one particular question, and that's where you lose a lot in this examination. With this, let's move as to how the classes will be taken forward. And in auditing and attestation, one of the key areas for every organization to be concerned about is fraud. As an auditor, even I am very concerned about fraud, because whenever there are errors being made on your financial statement, those are easy to be captured. Why? How? We'll talk more in detail about it, but as an auditor, my biggest concern area will be to assess the fraud risk within an organization. So let's start first with what is fraud and what is error. What's the primary difference? What's the fundamental difference between a fraud and an error? A lot of students ask me that question. And my friend, the basic difference between the two is the word intention. When we talk about errors, errors are unintentional misstatement or omissions. Unintentional mistakes in gathering and processing data. You can do that. If, let's say, for example, you're working with Airtel, how many customer masters you will be managing? Looking at the current size of India population, looking at the market share what Airtel has, you are talking about close to 30-40 crore people. And if you have to maintain their customer masters, it's going to be so very difficult that you're processing so much data. You just can't handle that out of Excel. One wrong formula, one wrong data processing point, the entire data goes for a loss. Do I ding you for that? Answer is no. As an auditor, if you can prove that it was not intentional, it was an error, and it was something which could have happened to anyone, I would not call out that the company is performing fraudulent practices. I would call that as an error, ask you to make amends, put that in my notes that these were audit observations and corrected accordingly, and present it to the board so that I'm clear, you guys are clear. Inaccurate accounting estimates. It can just so happen that when you bought a furniture, you thought the life expectation of the asset will be 10 years, depending on historical assessments, depending on market study. But in your usage for your organization, it resulted in just 3 years. That in 3 years, the asset was completely depreciated or the use for the asset was gone. What do you do after 3 years? Do you still carry that asset in your books of accounts? Answer is no. You've got to write it off because you're not generating any revenue for it. And as a result, what will happen? You need to change or book the entire depreciated value into the books in the same year. And you have to go back and tell your auditors, my mistake, I did an error in terms of estimating the life of the asset when I bought it. At that time, I understood that it was for 10 years. I used it in 3 years. This is the reason, blah, 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 blah. But if you can justify it was an error, nobody is going to ding you for that. Misunderstanding of accounting principles. We recently launched ASC 606, which is about revenue recognition. It was an upgrade from ASC 605. Now there will be certain misconceptions or a lack of clarity with regards to applying the accounting standard. Most of companies are applying to the best of their judgment what they understand how the accounting concept should be applied for. At the end of the day, if the auditor is not convinced or the market study later on proves to the point that the assessment which the company applied for was incorrect or there was some misunderstanding in terms of understanding all the scenarios of the accounting standard, it can so happen, but provided there was no intent. When we talk about fraud, it is an intentional act. There is use of deception resulting in misstatement. And when we talk about fraud, it just so happened that not just one individual has made any errors or mistake. There can be many people involved. And if management or those charged with governance are involved in fraud, then it's so very difficult to crack that fraud. Like I said, fraud is a bigger risk as compared to errors. Why? Because when there is fraud involved, there is concealment involved. The one who's doing fraud had the objective of doing it. We'll talk more about this as we progress. But first, let's understand what are the type of frauds which are available or which are there to be understood for. The first one is lying. Somebody gave you fraudulent financial reporting. How can you do fraudulent financial reporting? By manipulation, alteration, falsification of accounting records. You didn't book anything which was supposed to be booked. You inflated your revenue. You didn't book expenses so that your P&L shows rosy picture to your shareholders. Your valuation of the company goes higher. you forget to record any event or transaction from the financial statements, or you intentionally misapply any of the accounting principles. Like I said, we recently launched accounting principles on revenue and leases. It may just so happen that somebody knows the loophole within the accounting principles which are still not clarified by the respective authorities. And you are playing around with those loopholes right now just to say, hey, I never knew about it, whereas you knew exactly what you were doing. So wherever intent comes into picture, you fall into the category of fraud, and you're simply lying on your financial statements when you know you should not have been. The other type of fraud is called stealing. It's called misappropriation of assets. There was theft of assets entities. Now, generally talking about theft of assets and entity of the entity's asset, it may just so happen that it can never happen by one single individual. It will always happen when there are cartels being made. When the authorizer, the reviewer, and the custodian of the asset, they merge. Any of these two merge, and then they misappropriate the asset. The ARC fails: authorizer, reviewer, and custodian of the asset. If it fails, then only the asset can be stolen. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure the asset will be found within the premises. It may just so happen because of this particular aspect, the entity keeps on paying for something, whereas they have never utilized for those assets. So it is a bigger loss for an organization. Like I said, these are the type of frauds which can happen within an organization. But what causes fraud is also very important. What are the factors where fraud can happen, which can lead to fraud? And as an auditor, we should be aware of these factors. The first and the foremost factor is, what's the motive of doing it? What's the incentive of doing it? What's the pressure of doing such a fraud? Somebody is making a lot of money by doing it. Somebody is trying to protect their position by doing it. Or somebody is trying to help someone by doing it. What's the reason? So for any intentional activity, there has to be a motive behind it. It's only after the motive is proven that intent comes into picture. If there is no motive to cause fraud, it generally falls into the category of an error, because there was no motive to do that kind of activity. Once the intent is created, we know for a fact that yes, there was a motive behind it. Then we are going to talk about the second factor, which is about opportunity. Now somebody, and let's say for example, I want to embezzle cash out of my organization, I will not dare do that if I know for a fact that the moment I take cash out, within 24 hours, somebody will catch hold of it. Somebody will know that there is something missing. An opportunity comes where there is lack of internal control. When people lack internal control, it's only then people are incentivized to actually go and take that opportunity to do fraud. The last is rationalization and attitude of the organization's top management. If the tone of the top is to justify any of the scenarios where fraud is happening, to say, nah, that person can't do it, I don't believe it, rather than keeping a critical mind, then in that case, fraud can happen. When somebody gets into the comfort that my management is not going to ding me on the entire scenario, then that person is pretty comfortable taking up on that opportunity and fulfilling the incentive or pressure or motive of doing a fraud. So these are the three critical factors which should be there when an auditor is auditing any financials. They should keep that in mind. In last 20 years, we have seen biggest financial scandals around all these frauds. To talk about three biggest scandals, it was Waste Management, Enron, and Satyam Computers, which have happened in the last 20 years, where people lost billions of dollars only because these companies either manufactured data to keep them in the financial statements, inflating their revenue, inflating their balance sheet, inflating numbers so that stakeholder feels, oh wow, what the company is doing is great, but actually the company was going down. Who's responsible for all such acts? Who needs to take that responsibility that shareholders or the stakeholders of the company who are actually investing into that company are losing money? As you can see on the screen, before I talk about the consideration of fraud during an audit, let's talk about responsibilities. Who are responsible people? It's the management and the auditors. The management is responsible because they never created a good enough internal control environment within the company, and they never had a culture of integrity as well as ethics within the organization. It is only because these two were lacking, there was an opportunity which was created for people to do fraud. The auditors are equally responsible. Auditors should plan and perform the audit to obtain reasonable assurance. Underline, rather double underline the term reasonable assurance, because we're going to talk more about it. What do you mean by reasonable assurance? But it's the responsibility of the auditor to perform diligent actions to get reasonable assurance on the audit which they've performed. They should also identify detection risk in association with inherent risk and control risk within the organization. If the auditor can't preempt what sort of detection challenges of such frauds may happen, it may just result into bigger risk for the entire financials. How do you assess detection failures within the organization as an auditor? I may not be able to detect something which is wrong in your financials. How do you assess what's the maximum risk for that? It's only once you have understood what kind of controls are there, what kind of a control risk the organization carries, and what kind of inherent risk the organization carries. So both the parties are equally responsible. In the case of Satyam, we saw what happened to PwC, what happened to the CEO of the organization. For Enron and WorldCom, as well as Waste Management, Arthur Andersen had to be diluted in entirety, one of the auditing firms, because they didn't perform the activities which were required to be performed at that particular point of time. So as an auditor, we should also take into consideration of fraud during an audit. We should take reasonable assurance. When we talk about reasonable assurance, what do you mean by reasonable assurance? As an auditor, I am just performing sample check of what has been done by the finance team of the entity or my client. Will I be reworking on everything what they have done to get the comfort that everything is right? Answer is no. I don't get paid for it. However, I do get paid just to make sure that I provide assurance to people which is reasonable. That means I have done enough to tell that yes, instead of me, if you get anyone else to do this sort of a review, they would have done just about this much to make sure that the financials are correct, or I can make an opinion about whatever opinion, modified or qualified opinion, whatever opinion I want to make. I've done enough to do and reach to that level to provide for that assurance. As an auditor, I can never provide you with absolute assurance, because I am not going to rework about every aspect, every transaction, every event which has happened within the organization. And in case of fraud, like I talked about, there are chances of concealment where people can perform cartels, make cartels, get together and try to conceal things, since they already know that somebody is will try to get hold of their act, and in that case they will try to cover up on that kind of a fraud what they have done. The risk of non-detection of fraud is always higher than non-detection of an error, only because of the fact that somebody will not leave crumbs behind when they are doing fraud. They will try to wipe off everything to take off their name from the slate that they did something. It's very difficult to track, tracing any of these activities. Whereas in case of an error, it's so very clear that if the authorizer made an error, the reviewer or the custodian will actually call it out. The three pillars of the foundation of review mechanism within the organization. Last but not the least, we are going to talk about auditing requirements. As an auditor, you should always have professional skepticism. You should always have a questioning mind. Do critical assessment of all the audit evidences which have been provided to you for. Last but not the least, if there is any indication or information towards fraud, you should never rationalize it. You should never dismiss it. Rather, get to the root cause of why that indication came to you that there are chances of fraud which may happen. To do so, you should perform the following steps in the audit procedure. You should reach out to the engagement personnel and ask them if they are aware of any frauds or not. Discuss fraud risk with them at various levels, not just top management, at various levels. Talk about fraud, because then you get to know whether people are talking the same language or not. Obtain information of specific audit risk areas. We talked about stealing, we talked about lying. You can identify those areas and obtain risk information. Assess risk and develop appropriate actions. And last but not the least, perform analytical procedures. If anything is an outlier, get to know why it is there. What's the business reason? We were expecting revenue to grow at 20%. Why did one of the functions had expenses grow at 80%? What happened? What changed? With this, we come to an end of today's demo session. I hope you enjoyed it. I did. Thank you all for your patience. Have a good day. Bye.